Welcome back to MFO, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to another episode. I got one more video that I want to do that's semi-related to the trip that we took down to Santee Cooper. One of the things that we did look at some brush piles, and there were some big fish on these brush piles. But the interesting thing was, even when you were using forward-facing sonar and you were looking at the brush piles, you could see the fish. There were times when fish were suspended over those brush piles, and quite honestly, it was pretty easy to catch them, either with a jerkbait or with an Alabama rig. A lot of different options. But boy, I tell you what, you pull one or maybe two of them off of that brush pile, off of the top, where they were suspending over the top, and all of a sudden, you'd go back and kind of look and scan, and those fish would be really tight into that brush pile. What do you do then? How do you get those fish that have kind of hunkered into that brush pile? We're going to talk about that when we come back. Welcome back to Mark Fisher Outdoors, everybody. I'm Mark Fisher. So this did happen a lot. We had a lot of brush piles out on Lake Moultrie that we were looking at, and again, if on one of the practice days you go out there, you check it out, and sure enough, there's fish suspended over the brush piles out off to the side. They were pretty easy to catch. They weren't that difficult. At least one or two. Then you'd go back to it, or you'd try and get more, because you'd see 5 or 10 of them on that brush pile. But after you caught a couple, they'd really sink into that brush pile and get kind of into it, like the image that I'm showing you here. And when that happened, you could not call them out. Even if you swam a jerkbait over it or an A-rig over the top of it, you couldn't get them to come out of that brush pile to do that. They were kind of aware of, the fact that they were being targeted, and kind of were just hunkering into that. The way that I would suggest attacking those is, number one, obviously, when you do see the fish that are suspended over the brush pile, you go for those. Those are the low-hanging fruit, the ones that are going to be easy to get. Now, at this point, what I would do is I would continue to kind of come back to the brush pile, and when I see the ones that were inside, I wouldn't target those. But every once in a while, I would come back to it and scan around away from the brush pile, and I might find one that had roamed out from underneath the brush pile and was out roaming maybe 10, 15, 20 yards away, and was just kind of out in the open. Those fish were catchable. And those fish were the fish that once I would... So the brush pile, they were in the area of the brush pile, but they didn't always just hang out inside the brush pile. And so I used that as kind of the let's kind of expand from the brush pile. And sure enough, there were fish that were, within 20 to 30 yards of that brush pile that weren't hiding in the brush pile. And when you found one like this one here, that you could go and target that one. And because they weren't in that defensive mode, they weren't hiding, they were catchable. The other fish over here, the one that's near this stump, again, that if there was another isolated piece of cover, it wasn't the main brush pile itself, but another isolate, that fish would be catchable as well. The reality is, the ones that hunkered down inside the brush pile after you were caught, there wasn't a whole lot of, it wasn't worth spending a lot of time on them. Granted, I think you could throw a jig. You might be able to get a jig or some kind of maybe a shaky head or something in there. But the reality is I don't know that you'd be able to get them to bite. I believe those fish, as I said, were in kind of a very defensive posture, hiding, and knew they were being targeted. But the reality, even if they did bite, you would have a hard time pulling them out of that kind of cover that was in 20 feet of water. So I did not do that. I'm not saying it's not worth, attempting that, but the point that I want to make is you certainly want to, when the fish are above and around the brush pile, go for those fish using a jerk bait or an A-rig or a swim bait or any of those types of offerings. But be aware of the fact that brush piles can kind of end up being a hub, and that the fish will not only just be around that brush pile, but they'll spread out and use that forward facing to kind of check or just blind cast around, because sometimes the fish will spread out from that brush pile and be there, and those fish are catchable because they aren't in that kind of defensive hunkering down kind of posture. So something that I learned last week that I wanted to kind of share with you. I appreciate you tuning in. I appreciate all of your support. Have a great weekend, and we will see you again on Monday for another episode of Mark Fisher Outdoors. Take care, everybody.